In the 1970s, gamblers were walking into casinos wearing computers, not laptops, not calculators, computers. And around the same time, casinos began losing in ways they couldn't explain. They weren't catastrophic losses, nothing dramatic enough to make headlines, just the kind that linger, the kind that show up in spreadsheets and make someone upstairs tap a pencil a little harder than usual. The roulette wheels were fine, the dealers were fine, the rules hadn't changed, and yet certain players kept walking away a little heavier than probability suggested they should. It didn't look like cheating. There were no magnets, no shaved wheels, no fast hands. Surveillance reviewed tape after tape and found nothing but ordinary men placing ordinary bets, except they weren't guessing. They were measuring. These players wore computers you weren't supposed to notice. Yes, machines you'd never recognize. No screens, no buttons, nothing glowing beneath their jackets. Most of the hardware was stitched into shoes or taped against a thigh under department store slacks. A thin wire ran quietly along a seam. A pressure switch hid under a toe. 3 feet away, you'd swear the guy was deciding whether to order another drink. What you were actually looking at was a physics experiment with a drink ticket. Casinos didn't catch on immediately. Why would they? Roulette felt settled, established, a permanent resident of human optimism. The brass spindle turned, the ivory ball skimmed the rim with that dry whisper gamblers know too well. Dealers spun with the relaxed posture of people who believed the house edge was less a statistic and more a law of nature. And right in the middle of that confidence, someone began timing the spin. And that's where the story quietly leaves the casino floor. Because the real action wasn't happening under chandeliers. It was happening under fluorescent lights that buzzed like they were personally offended by ambition. Far from the desert, in rooms that smelled like solder and stale coffee, a few stubborn minds decided that if the wheel insisted on spinning, it might as well answer some questions. Roulette feels chaotic when you're leaning over the felt, chips stacked like miniature monuments, breath tightening as the ball rattles downward. The sound alone can scramble your judgment, but beneath the noise, the wheel obeys something older than superstition. Steel, friction, deceleration curves. Physics keeps receipts. It does not care about your lucky shirt. Out along the California coast, on campuses where chalk dust hung in the air and long hair brushed against lab coats, a small group of young physicists and mathematicians began asking a question that casinos preferred no one phrase too clearly. What if the wheel could be measured? Guesses weren't enough. Intuition wasn't either. They wanted measurements. They were the kind of people who argued over graph paper the way folks like me argue about barbecue technique, intensely, confidently, and convinced everyone else was doing it wrong. One of them reportedly had a laugh that echoed down laboratory corridors. Another barely spoke unless numbers were involved. Collectively, they carried just enough confidence to attempt something that sounded ridiculous over coffee and obvious under fluorescent lighting. A roulette wheel is a physical object. The ball slows in predictable increments. The rotor spins with measurable velocity. Capture enough revolutions, and the future narrows slightly. It wouldn't point to a single number. That kind of certainty belongs in prayer circles. What it could do was narrow the landing zone, a slice thinner than chance intended. And in gambling, thin slices pay mortgages, or at least they keep the lights on long enough to try again next week. Of course, ideas are polite. Prototypes are not. The moment theory meets a screwdriver, things get interesting. The first prototypes looked like science fair projects that had wandered into a crime novel. Hand-soldered components, early microprocessors that strained to deserve the name. Circuit boards trimmed down until they could hide without bulging through fabric. One tap of a toe marked the instant the dealer released the ball. Another marked a rotation of the wheel. The device processed those intervals and returned its conclusion as a vibration pattern against the skin. No flashing lights, no dramatic reveals, just a coded pulse. To anyone watching, it looked like a nervous tick, and casinos are very familiar with nervous ticks. They eventually called themselves Eudaimonic Enterprises, a name borrowed from Greek philosophy about human flourishing. It sounded less like a gambling crew and more like a campus debate society. And it's true, they didn't look like the legends of the felt. No gold watches, no table theatrics, just solder burns and quiet eyes. But for a few years, they belonged in the same conversations. Among them was a young physicist named Doyne Farmer, who would later become known for his work in complex systems. At the time, he was studying roulette wheels. Field tests happened quietly. Reno, Lake Tahoe, Las Vegas. One member would stand at the wheel. Another lingered a few feet away, appearing mildly bored. A third might hover near a slot machine, pretending to care about cherries. The bettor waited. Dealer releases the ball, toe tap, wheel rotation, second tap, the device hums. Gravity does its work. Then comes the whisper, a brief vibration indicating which section of the wheel to favor. The chips move late, calmly, not recklessly late, but with the kind of timing that makes surveillance rooms lean forward in their chairs. It didn't win every spin. That would have triggered sirens. Losses were part of the camouflage. Enough misses to preserve plausible randomness. Over hours, though, the pattern emerged the way a shoreline materializes through fog. Faint at first, then undeniable if you knew how to look. A small edge applied patiently over time. Casinos can smile through a lucky streak. Consistency, though, makes them reach for the rule book. Somewhere in Nevada, a dealer reportedly began noticing that one particular player always placed bets just as the ball began surrendering speed. Not hurried, not desperate, confident, as though he'd read a spoiler. One account from a Reno floor manager describes a Tuesday night that wouldn't leave his head. Nothing glamorous, no high rollers, just a midweek crowd and a wheel that kept behaving politely. A young man in an unremarkable blazer played for 40 minutes. He never rushed, never celebrated, never chased. His bets landed late, always late, just as the ball began surrendering speed. He left up a few thousand, not enough to trigger alarms, but just enough to feel deliberate. The manager reviewed the tape 3 times. The player's hand stayed visible. No signals, no distractions, no accomplices hovering too close, just a slight weight shift before each bet. The report filed that night ended with a sentence no casino executive enjoys reading. Unclear mechanism. Surveillance rewound tape. They searched for magnets, unusual hand movements, dealer collusion. Nothing obvious. The player's hand stayed visible. The wheel remained untouched. The ball behaved normally. The intelligence wasn't on the table. That realization took time. Word traveled the way it does in casinos, sideways, half-formed, carried in low voices between shifts, late bets, calm expressions, unusual steadiness. Security teams began studying shoes and trouser cuffs with new curiosity. In surveillance rooms, attention narrowed. Operators began slowing footage down frame by frame. They zoomed in on ankles, on pant seams, on moments where a heel lifted half an inch longer than necessary. One internal memo warned dealers about players exhibiting mechanical timing behavior. Mechanical timing behavior. That phrase alone tells you how unsettled they were. Casinos understand luck. They understand cheating. What unsettles them is precision. Precision feels repeatable. Policies evolved. Signs appeared clarifying that electronic devices were not welcome at the tables. Dealers were encouraged to vary their spin speed deliberately to avoid falling into rhythmic habits. The house adapted. The physicists adjusted right back. Nobody was throwing punches. They were trading adjustments like chess players who refused to blink. Electronics shrank. Integrated circuits tightened their footprint. What once required bulk began disappearing into fabric. Wires flattened. Processors grew quicker. For a while, it became a quiet contest between motion and measurement. There's something quietly absurd about it. Billion-dollar resorts glowing under desert chandeliers, while somewhere beneath a pair of perfectly respectable loafers, a homemade computer waited for a toe tap like it had chores to do. There were no explosions, no cinematic heists, just arithmetic quietly doing its job. Stories later surfaced beyond Nevada, England, Australia, across Europe. Some verified, others inflated in smoky bars long after closing time. Teams experimenting with belt buckle sensors, modified calculators that bore little resemblance to their original purpose, partners communicating through subtle touches. Regulators eventually caught up. In several jurisdictions, using a device to predict roulette outcomes crossed from clever to criminal. Legal language hardened, surveillance rooms expanded, the line sharpened, the romance dimmed a bit. Casinos prefer their legends uncomplicated. Still, the image lingers. Young minds hunched over soldering irons, convinced that if the wheel obeyed physics, then physics could be persuaded to cooperate. They weren't dismantling machines or bribing dealers. They were listening. One physicist later described standing at the table while the hidden device worked, the air thick with cigarette smoke, chips clinking in uneven rhythms, a dealer's practiced voice cutting through ambient noise. Beneath it all, a vibration against his leg, coded, private, almost intimate, like holding a second heartbeat. There's something human in that. It isn't heroic, and it isn't sinister, just curiosity sharpened by opportunity. Casinos rely on the long arc of probability. Over enough spins, the house edge asserts itself with the calm inevitability of sunrise. The prediction teams tried to compress that arc, not eliminate it, just lean into the part where physics briefly revealed its hand. While a roulette wheel feels mystical from a distance, up close, it's wood and metal obeying simple rules. When someone starts proving that, the mystique wobbles. By the 90s, tech had marched into public view. Laptops appeared in coffee shops. Phones began shrinking toward the inevitable future. What once required secret circuitry now fit comfortably in a backpack, just not inside a casino without consequence. Surveillance had grown sharper, legal frameworks clearer. The cat and mouse slowed. The phantom era faded. The math never stopped working, but the environment stopped tolerating it. Yet every so often, a new story surfaces. A team somewhere testing fresh sensors, a faster processor, someone convinced that perhaps the wheel has grown complacent. Give risk enough time, and someone will try again. When people think of casino innovation, they picture slot machines with louder lights or blackjack side bets with flashier names. Few imagine a handful of physicists in the 1970s quietly pressing silicon against their skin and stepping into a room built on chance. Roulette never promised fairness. No, to many of us, it's about the faint hope of possibility. The house framed that possibility in percentages. The prediction teams treated it as a mechanical event. That shift changed the mood at the table. Fate sounds romantic. Friction comes with footnotes. Dealers began varying their release speed deliberately, like drummers shifting tempo to keep dancers guessing. Some sensed they were being studied long before they could articulate why, an instinct that the rhythm had become too predictable. Awareness moved back and forth across green felt without a word spoken. Nowadays, if you stand near a roulette wheel long enough, you'll notice how people lean forward when the ball begins its descent. There's a shared intake of breath, a communal pause where everyone waits to see which pocket claims the future. In the 1970s, a few gamblers leaned forward with something else tucked into their shoes, a quiet companion built from microchips and stubbornness. While others trusted hunches or colors, they listened for a pulse only they could feel. Most of the room never knew, and that was essential. The ball still clicked against the frets. The dealer still called the number in the same practiced tone. Chips still slid across felt in small ceremonies of loss and gain. Underneath, gravity performed exactly as it always had. Someone simply started counting more carefully. And counting, as it turns out, makes people uncomfortable. The lights never flickered. The chandeliers never dimmed. The desert kept glowing like it always had. Roulette survived. The house edge survived. Most players never realized the wheel had briefly been reduced to a timing problem. Maybe that's fitting, because gambling has always lived in the narrow space between belief and calculation, between a raised eyebrow and a raised statistic, between someone trusting a feeling and someone trusting a stopwatch. For a few years, in a handful of casinos, that stopwatch was hidden in a shoe. It didn't topple empires or bankrupt Las Vegas. Mathematics survived just fine. It simply proved that even in rooms built on chance, someone is always listening for the pattern beneath the noise. Stand near a roulette wheel long enough, and you'll still see it. The lean forward, the held breath, the little prayer nobody admits to saying out loud. The ball clicks. The dealer calls the number. Chips move. People react. Gravity does what gravity has always done. Somewhere in the long memory of casino floors, there's the faint echo of circuitry pressed close to bone. A reminder that for a brief stretch of time, mathematics slipped quietly through the doors in polished leather shoes and asked the wheel a very impolite question. For a moment, the wheel gave something away. There are other legends worth remembering. If you'd like to stay at the table a little longer, you'll find a few of them right here.